Hi, here's May. In today's video, I'll show you my full illustration process. Seeing how other artists draw has helped me a lot since I like to take advice from different artists and combine what I learned from my own illustrations, so I hope this is helpful to you as well. Before I even start to draw, I like to have a clear idea of what I want to draw in mind. I like to plan the character I'm drawing and most of the time the outfit, pose and camera angle and sometimes even lighting. Whether you want to just draw and go with whatever you come up with along the way, or you like to have a clear plan like me, can depend on if you're a rather spontaneous or organized person. I do all the planning and concepting beforehand by either gathering references and sometimes using 3D models or making thumbnail sketches of poses and outfits. For the illustration I'm drawing here, I made a mood board first where I determined these aspects. I wanted to draw Shu and Mika from Ensemble Stars in the outfits they wear for the Arcante performance. Then I gathered a bunch of Ensemble Stars card illustrations as inspiration for the lighting and background I would draw later on. Let me know if you would like to see me break down Ensemble Stars or other games illustrations in the future. Other than artists, these styles are really fascinating to me as well. I also used 3D models as pose references. I posted these in Clip Studio Paint. I tried drawing in it, but I prefer using Krita, the software I've been using since I started drawing digitally 3 years ago. I'm used to the tools there and I especially like the pop-up palette. No matter what software you are using to draw, it's good to determine the tools you want to use and set up the workspace in a way that you like to use it. This can lead to saving a lot of time while drawing. For me, I like to work with a minimalistic, simple workspace, not having too many windows open. I have my layers panel up here. There are also tool options and the advanced color selector. Below this panel I have the color palette, brushes as well as the recorder window. On the left side of my canvas are all the tools. Then I use a lot of shortcuts while drawing. I put them up on screen. I also like to use a lot of layers. This is why I made a predefined layer structure in a separate Krita document, which I copy and paste into my illustration files. Okay, that would be it for all the preparation as well as my general setup for drawing. Now let's get into the actual process. And here I show the process with Mika's illustration along with a few parts from the Shu one. I'm doing this because I started with the Shu illustration and drew Mika's illustration afterwards, which is why I reused a few parts from the Shu illustration for the Mika one, and for these parts I'll show how I drew them in the Shu process. More on that later. We start with the sketch. For this I'm using this brush and I used different colors for different parts of the outfit here. Since I had a 3D model, I was able to just trace over most of the body. I like to add in some anatomy indication lines. When I'm coming up with a pose myself, I like to experiment with leg, head or arm angles sometimes. What I almost always have variations for would be the hand poses. I usually sketch in maybe 2 to 5 different ones. For drawing the head, I always use guidelines to help me with drawing the features in perspective. I explained more about what features I place where in this older head tutorial video I made. For the nose, I basically always use 2 lines and a nostril, or just 1 line depending on the character. Especially for sketching the eyes, I try to pay close attention to how they are unique for the character. The eyes are what is most often unique for anime characters, just like the hair, what I'll talk about next. When I sketch in the hair, I like to start with the bangs and silhouette and add smaller hair strands later on. At first, I try to recognize the overall structure of the hair. Is it very curly, fluffy or straight and sharp? What would an example hair strand look like? When I have this figured out, I implement the structure when drawing the hair. I also, of course, use references of the character I'm drawing, just like with the outfit. I look at my reference and in some cases I will simplify things, but most of the time I just draw what I see here. For the hands, I mostly use hand reference images and draw from them. Often I include some variations here. I mention what I do after sketching before moving on to the line art, as well as after the line art before moving on to shading. I fill in the silhouette for the head and hair. I do this to see if anything looks off. Then I go through some checklists and adjust my sketch or line art if I find anything looking off. In general, when it comes to adjusting my drawing, whether it's for the sketch or line art, I use the lasso selection, transform and liquefy tools. Also, I have a question. Would you be interested in a video where I just share illustration tips? Let me know in the comments. Now let's move on to the line art. This is the brush I use for my line art. It has a slight texture with some pressure sensitivity. I'm able to draw thicker and thinner lines that have varying opacity with this. For drawing the line art, I at first turn down the opacity of my sketch folder. I go over my sketch and try to make the silhouette lines thicker than the inner lines. I'm also the kind of person who redraws a lot of lines. I want them to not look too stiff and be flowy. Using less pressure while drawing helps me with this. I tend to spend the most time on the face and hair. Here, the lashes will most often be the thickest lines in my art. After this, I move on to the body. Often I start with the hands, since other than the face, they can be pretty expressive and important. Here I mostly draw 3 lines for each finger's upper and lower side to replicate the 3 finger joints. I also draw in inner hand lines and fingernails. Since Mika is wearing gloves here, I only showed the hand lines though. Then we move on to the outfit line art. I like to start with the silhouette and bigger outlines, adding in folds as well. For folds, I sometimes like to not draw full lines but leave a few empty spaces in between, since it makes them appear not as harsh. I look at the folds I've drawn and ask myself if they look believable as I'm doing this. Then I pay attention to my lines not being too straight or rounded here to portray the different outfit parts. Something I've also been experimenting with is adding depth to some thicker outfit parts, like the collar or the belt around Mika's waist here. It adds more 3Dness. In most anime styles, I don't see artists doing this and focusing on portraying the outfit parts with 2D lines, but I myself like the look of it in some art, so I've been trying this out myself as well. After I've drawn most parts of the overall outfit, I add accessoires like jewelry. Here I also focus on doing more straight lines often, since these pieces will be more symmetrical with a clear structure, like diamonds. I'm also copying and pasting parts, for example for the triangular shapes on the collar here, sometimes if it works for the illustration. The same goes for drawing patterns on the outfit, what I'll talk about next. For patterns, the difference in how I portray them and how I often see them being portrayed is that they don't have an outline. I draw these in a separate layer using my sketching or line art brush, depending on how detailed and small the pattern is. Here I actually copied the pattern layer from the Shu illustration and pasted it in, transforming parts and redrawing some of them. It's important that all parts are in correct perspective here, the patterns as well as the parts of the outfit. Since I didn't draw them in before, I also added the gloves and an accessoire around the waist afterwards. Similarly to what I did for the sketch, I then fill in the heads and hair silhouette. I also make some notes on my canvas for things I want to change at this or other stages of my process. Before moving on to coloring, I then erase my overlapping line art. To do this, I put a colored clipping mask above my layers for each folder to see which layer has which line art included in it. After this, I duplicate my line art layer a bunch of times and merge it. I still keep a copy of the original line art though. Then it's time for filling in flat colors. I used a duplicated copy of my line art here, since this way I'm able to use the Magic Wand selection tool to fill in colors. I have the grow selection option at 2 pixels, meaning my selection will go over the line art by 2 pixels. I often like to first establish the color palette I want to use on the side to see if all colors would look nice together. Here I looked at my references and chose colors based on this. I often change up the colors to be slightly more purpley and bright. For drawing Mika, I was able to use the same palette I had established before for Shu's illustration. I put each color into a separate layer group. This helps me with shading my illustration, what I move on to next. This step is optional, meaning I don't do this every time, but when it comes to more detailed illustrations where I want to include complex lighting, I like to first paint in light on a separate layer above all my color layers. For this, I can use different colors depending on the setting and atmosphere I want the illustration to have. This helps me to establish the lighting setup I want to use and to figure out how the shadows of different parts would be cast in it. Then we move on to my general shading workflow. For shading each color, sometimes I have one or sometimes multiply shadow layers on top of my flat color layer. Here I go through all my color folders, starting with the skin. I begin with the shadows cast by the neck and hair, as well as the outfit parts and other general shadows. I add more shading on separate layers for the nose and eyes after this. For the nose, I do a slightly blended shadow on it, which is darker at the bottom. I put the darkest shadow around the eyes underneath the eyebrow and add other shadows around the eyelid and underneath the eye. Sometimes I'll also add some blush on the cheeks. Then I move on to the hair. I often make selections of mainly zigzag shapes and paint them in. I for once add shadows cast by the direction of light. Here these would be on the left side since the light is coming from the right. Then I add smaller shadows that define hair strands and are cast from the hair strands. Next would be shadows at the top of the hair around its origin as well as the bottom of the hair. With these I want to show that the head has a spherical shape, the bottom and top being darker while the middle is brighter. Finally, I add in smaller shadow details, sometimes around shapes or just to show some more hair strands. For light on the hair, I will sometimes paint in brighter hair strands. Here I didn't include this though and just moved on to the highlights. I either paint them freehand or using selections. I want them to appear biggest around the forehead, the front of the head most of the time, while making sure that they follow the head's perspective. They are kind of perpendicular to the hair strand's direction. Finally, I paint in some light around the face on the hair. I mostly use the skin color on a overlay layer for this. Next up is the eye shading. I started with the white of the eye and putting shadows underneath. Sometimes I'll also shade around the whole eyeball like I did here. Here are all the layers I use to shade the iris, the outline shadow, the general shadow, the overlay at the bottom, and small lights. I use different colors depending on the character here. Finally, I move on to the outfit, and here I'm mentioning my overall approach to shading. This would also apply to the parts I shaded beforehand. The technique I use to shade would be to either make lasso selections, painting them in with a airbrush, or paint in shadows manually using a hard brown brush with varying opacity. Often I combine both techniques. I sometimes will add a slight darker outline around shadows if it fits to me. For the colors I'm using to shade, generally these would be based on the flat color but a bit darker and more saturated, shifting the hue in a purple direction. For shading folds, I like to make sure the shadows fit to the outfit's material. Using Pinterest and other art references helps a lot here. The folds on the fabric here would be more rounded because the material is rather thin, for example. Finally, for shading the gold, like here, I used references again, adding shaded as well as lighter parts. I also add in more varying line thickness often. Sometimes I will do this before coloring or afterwards. Now we're done with shading, and for this illustration I also decided to include a background. I don't do this often, but I quickly explain how I approach this as well here. For this, I also switch into the Shu illustration file since I painted the background in there and reuse parts of it for the Mika illustration. Since I use Clip Studio Paint, I was able to use the grids and guides of the 3D model from there here. This is practical when it comes to using this program. Like this, I didn't have to worry about the background's perspective while drawing. I went for a lineless style here. This is often the case in other CG illustrations and helps to make the character stand out from the background. For drawing the elements, I started off with blocking in shapes for the objects in a proper perspective. I then refined them later on while making sure to not include too much detail. For one, because I didn't want the background to distract from the character, and then because I didn't want to spend too much time on it because I knew it slightly blurred in the end anyways. Still, I didn't want parts to look too empty and added shelves, a lamp, as well as frames on the wall, all inspired by these Ensemble Stars images. I used the basic round brush, airbrush, along with a textured brush for the wood. For drawing backgrounds, I also always make sure the values and colors work with the character, that the lighting of the character and background as well as the colors match up. Here the lighting was rather warm and yellowish, apart from a blue light from the left. I represented this in the background by adding mostly yellowish, warm and a few cooler brown tones. The darkest parts and parts with most contrast of this illustration still are the character though. As finishing touches, I then added in some small sparkles. I find adding elements like these, small particles, lights, stars, hearts and so on, really make the illustration look more special. Finally, let's talk about the final adjustments. Before I moved on to this stage, I critiqued my illustration. Here are some notes I wrote down for the Mika illustration I would want to adjust. To make these adjustments, I first like to merge my colors and line art layer. I also like to color my lines using a blurred copy of my color layer for this. Here are the exact steps I use to color my lines. First, I merge my color layers, then I put a copy of this colored layer into a group with my line art layer. Next, I make a selection of this group, which I fill in with a color. For this illustration, I went with a warm gold tone since it fit to the background. The color won't be that visible in the end though, since I clipped my copied color layer above it. After this, I duplicate this colored layer and blur it using the Gaussian blur filter mask. I blur it by around 20 pixels for once, then I duplicate this again and blur it by 100 pixels. Finally, I duplicate this blurred by 100 pixels layer a bunch of times and merge all of these 100 pixel blurred copies. I then merge this whole group and put it on top of my line art layer. Oh, and make sure that only the color layers are clipped, not the flat color base. Now for the line art group, I add a filter mask to adjust the blurred color layer clipped to it. Next, I duplicate this and set the duplicate to multiply. After this, I do the same thing for my whole line art layer, duplicating it and setting the duplicate to multiply. I also add in a dark brown color clipped on top of the normal line art folder here and adjust the opacity to make sure my lines are dark enough. Finally, I add a blur filter mask to this normal line art folder, blurring the lines by around 2 pixels, which makes the art appear softer. For this illustration, I also decided to copy the normal line art layer and set this copy to overlay. How I adjust the lines other than adding the colored copy and dark brown layer, as well as blurring some of the line art, can vary a bit from illustration to illustration. Finally, I merged all my layers and then it was time to make all the adjustments I defined in my critique. Merging all layers beforehand is really important so I can make these adjustments quickly. Still, having all layers in the folder would lead to taking a very long time to liquefy or transform parts, for example. Here I'm doing exactly this, using mostly liquefy or transform to move parts, as well as painting over from time to time. I basically went through my critique and adjusted each aspect. I also talked about how I do the critiquing and fixing my art step in this video. Alright, and that's it for the full process of making a character illustration like this. If you have any questions about my process or want to share some helpful tips for drawing illustrations, feel free to leave a comment. And in case you're a N-Stars fan, let me know some of your favorite characters or songs. I'd love to talk more about anything N-Stars or art related in the comments. I hope the video was insightful and inspiring to you. Have a great day and bye.